My name is Katie Fehrenbacher. I'm senior writer for GigaOM, which is a new media journalism site based in San Francisco, and we write about entrepreneurs, investors, startup companies, and I particularly look at entrepreneurs and startups in the energy and so-called clean tech space. Today we're going to be talking about why storytelling and narrative are important for early stage technologies and research, and in particular why they're important for early stage energy technologies. I've got a great group of panelists here today. Saul Griffith, who founded Otherlab, and also Dave Blakeley, who is the leads the technology strategy for IDEO, a design firm. And before we get into, they're going to talk a little bit about some of their passions. I just wanted to share two anecdotes about why energy technologies really need kind of the power of narratives. Earlier this year, kind of during a talk that Tony Fadell, the CEO and founder of Nest, gave, he talked about, he makes a device, the smart thermostat. You guys may or may not have seen it, but he said his original narrative and story he put together several years ago for the funding deck for his pitch for Nest. It was actually the same story that he continued to tell over and over again. He told in his marketing products. That's how he designed the product. So it was from that original story and narrative he created that he built the entire company off of. So that's anecdote one. The second anecdote is a couple years ago, the CEO of Tesla, Elon Musk, who you guys are going to hear from tomorrow, talked about the importance of prototyping for early stage energy technologies, and basically said, in the early days of Tesla, the company was looking to do a deal with Daimler, which was a really crucial one, and they built an all-electric smart car, and it was just through that prototype and telling kind of this visual narrative around creating this device that they actually got this deal with Daimler. So even before the company was producing product, there's a way to kind of create prototypes, create narratives, tell stories that will be really crucial to your long-term business plan. So, and I wanted to introduce Dave Blakeley. So he leads the technology practice at IDEO, like I said. They're an over 2-decade-old design and consulting firm in the Bay Area. They pioneered the idea of design thinking. And Dave spends a lot of his time working with IDEO's clients like NASA or Cisco, Qualcomm, Johns Hopkins, and helps them foster Silicon Valley-style innovation at their companies. And Saul, he's a longtime inventor, engineer, and co-founder of Otherlab, which is a sort of incubator for crazy energy ideas. Energy, transportation, math, computing, design. He creates products like electric 2- and 3-wheelers and soft robotics and new types of water sports even. And he was also the co-founder of high-altitude wind company Makani Power, so he has a background in energy. So they're each going to talk a little bit about some narratives and stories that they created and that have inspired them. And then we're going to go into a discussion. So,
well, thanks, Katie, for the gracious introduction. When we planned for this, I was happy to hear that we were going to be talking narrative a little bit, because the converted are always the most zealous, and I am an electrical engineer by training who, since joining IDEO, which is an innovation firm, has really become a convert to the power of narrative. What is narrative not? Narrative is not what I thought it was when I joined IDEO, which is a Super Bowl ad. It's some cute, hot story that is appended to some product or service or something else that's put out by some manufacturer. What's narrative about? I don't think I need to tell anybody here. Technology changes very rapidly. Business models come up all the time and then wither and die. But people are still people, and fundamentally, people respond to narrative. We are fundamentally wired as human beings to respond to stories. And I just wanted to share some examples in my career at IDEO that particularly stand out around narrative. This is a product which is called a Vocera communicator. It was originally called TrekLink. And the big idea here was that, as with so many other Silicon Valley innovators, the founders of TrekLink, a guy named Rob Shostak, was really inspired by Star Trek. Who knew? He was inspired by Captain Picard touching his badge and being able to communicate with anybody around him. And we were very proud of the engineering design that we did, the preliminary design we did for Vocera based on their friends and family money. We had the risks mitigated good engineering style, right? We had done analysis and iterative prototyping of things like how big the battery needed to be to get the battery life required, and how what the total thickness needed to be, how to get good quality, sound quality out of the little itty-bitty speakerphone. We were getting virtually no traction out of the VCs, which was of particular concern to us because we had made a small investment in the company, IDEO had. It was not until we created a narrative, and in this case we created a video with actors that showed the use of a little, essentially a lapel-worn speakerphone in medical applications as an alternative to the constantly blaring PA systems that they have in hospitals, calling doctors saying, you know, come stat and things like that. We had an idea, and we put together a short video. And the lead investor, a guy named Don Wood, ultimately credited the video for bringing the concept to life in a way that, you know, PowerPoint presentations could not, even for, you know, experienced and trained investors. I want to point something out about this. Ultimately, Vocera's application didn't have to do with medical. There are regulations called HIPAA, which are around privacy, which made it difficult for them to move forward. Their applications had to do with big box retail as an alternative to PA systems there, and big enterprise. But something that this and a statistically significant number of experiences pointed out to me is this. There's a rule of narrative that I use when I'm working with VCs or working with huge companies to assess new and early and embryonic ideas, which is that if you've got a compelling narrative, even if ultimately that narrative isn't the right one, if you've got a very hot narrative and a hot story associated with the stakeholders that need to use your product or service, you've got an extremely good chance of success. And if you do not, you've really got a problem, and you've got to rethink this. And one of the first questions I always ask people is, tell me about a story. Tell me the story in a day of the life of your typical end customer, stakeholder, user, decision maker, whatever it is. Another interesting example that I wanted to share of narrative, working for an innovation consultancy, I would have a hard time telling you the coolest project I've ever worked on, but definitely the biggest honor was to work with NASA with astronauts, including some crusty old guys that walked on the moon, and talk to them about their experiences with spacesuits in order to help NASA design their next generation of spacesuits. And ultimately, something that these guys had never done, despite all the post-work that's happened, interviewing Apollo astronauts and Skylab astronauts and International Space Station astronauts, is we built a story with them right on the spot. We spent about 2 full days in a large conference room with illustrators, and we built a narrative pointing out new ideas for spacesuits. Some of the ideas that came out you can see in the pictures. These are some of the things the illustrator came up with, were spacesuits that you could step into quickly like a pair of long johns, and a small pressurized vehicle that had some of the advantages of spacesuits without some of the incumbent problems such as lack of dexterity and limited mobility and so on. And ultimately, the ideas were presented at President Obama's first inauguration. I can draw for you a straight line between sort of the galvanizing quality of those initial narratives and the prototypes and the work that's still in process. The last thing I want to say is, video is just a fantastic tool. And if you're considering a more expository means of communication, here's a program that we came up with for emergency relief for Microsoft. And I have to admit, as someone whose background is hardcore engineering, I would be tempted to say, we imagine a product with the following 3 features and create bullet points and things like that. And in fact, the designers I worked with created a flash simulation. This sort of thing is really fast. I'm sure you all seen these things. It was about a week to assemble the concepts, another week to create the graphics, and about 3 more days to create the complete animation. And I really feel like to catalyze the decision to move forward with Microsoft Vine, a simulation like this, which is just a free-running simulation, obviously, I'm not doing anything to the screen, did much more to catalyze the technical decision makers and the business decision makers than more of a straight expository description would have. Saul.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Katie. I was a little nervous when I was asked to talk at the session where you are selling a future that doesn't yet exist, which might mean this is the charlatan session. Yeah, I work at Otherlab. Most of my story, I've been extremely fortunate over the last 10 years to work on a project with a comic book illustrator called Nick Dragotta and his wife Ingrid Dragotta, who was a product designer. And we write comic books for 8 to 12-year-olds that teach them science and engineering. And what I have learned about narrative from that process has been extraordinary and will illustrate my talk today. You can probably see by the quality of these illustrations, Nick actually draws people like Spider-Man for a living. And I thought this was an appropriate one to start off. This is the history of energy technology. And hopefully we'll do something better, and that's what we're working on here at ARPA-E. So the power of illustrations like this is enormous in emoting historical events and heroic space program type activities. This was something we drew at about the period I started a company called Makani Power. I'm going to emphasize that this is actually my day job looks like, is doing lots of heroic work to come up with things like this. This is actually the sort of the physical relationship that told us that the idea of high altitude wind power was a good idea. And that's not exactly something that a venture capitalist or even the average program manager may have the time to untangle. So how do you turn that equation into a vision like this is a really useful thing. So this is, circa 2007, 2008, the image of what we were selling Makani Power. So we had built some kites and generated tiny amounts of electricity at this point, but they looked nothing like this. But we'd learned that the world already had a whole lot of questions that were much more easily solved with an image than with words. So for example, in this image, it answers one of the most frequently asked questions, how do you land this thing? So that, you do bring these things down and you land them in a nest. How do you generate the power? You can see the two wind turbines on that wing. How do you array these things in a field? Do they fly in the same airspace? In the background, you have this hint that many of these fly in a wind farm somewhat similar to a traditional wind farm. And it was enormously easier to explain not only to venture capitalists and investors and the media, but even to new employees. This is the vision of the future. And particularly on a project like Makani, actually I noticed Damon and Jeff and Alden and two of the Erics just walk in. They've actually now realized this wing. It doesn't look exactly like this, but it shares a lot of the DNA. And, in a project that takes, half a decade or more, as these sort of heroic technology projects do, having these narratives and images really helps, even in just keeping people motivated about that end goal. On narrative, I've made a lot of mistakes on narrative. I used to try and sell a lot of things with the horror story that probably motivates a lot of you. Climate change is happening. The news media reminds us every day that it's hell in a handbasket. I think this is an unsuccessful narrative that I'm going to discourage you all from using. This is sort of more of that dystopian future. Very easy for comic book illustrators to illustrate dystopian futures. I think we all really need to offer people a vision of the future that can be absolutely stunning and beautiful. I think I would critique all of us in collectively not telling the story that the future can be better if you allow us to create these new technologies, and that we need to really endeavor to do that. So a couple more examples again. So here was some physics insight that led us to work on solar technology. Layla Madrone is in the front here. I work with her on that. This was the very first prototype. Basically, those equations said you want to make the mirrors for collecting solar as small as possible, which means you need a new type of actuator that's extraordinarily cheap. We made it work at this scale, but then again, you show this type of prototype to people, and it's a little bit too rough around the edges, too much of a joke. So you have to illustrate what I actually call it, bridging the imagination gap of people. Right, so there's the old technology in the corner of that, the enormous heliostats, heavy. Here are the small heliostats. Again, subtle hints to a whole lot of people's questions. How high off the ground are these? And you can see they're waist high. And a whole lot of questions can be sort of subtly and even unconsciously answered with this type of illustration. this is sort of, and as regards narrative, this is something that is real. It's actually a whole lot of mirrors on the side of a parking garage, a sculpture built by an artist, Ned Kahn, which actually inspired our work. And before this image existed, we would show people this image. And it got a sense of the arrays and the small scale. The only problem was this everyone who is concerned about heliostats would say, oh, look, you have a wind problem there, which we do. But not a new technology. So here's yet another example. This is a recent project. Tucker Gilman, one of my other colleagues here, were working on natural gas storage technology. This basically says, combined with this graph, that there's a good reason, instead of having these bulky cylindrical tanks, to make things more like an intestine. Shrink the size of your storage cylinders, and then you can lay them out in all sorts of ways, which has a whole lot of examples. And there's sort of ongoing jokes in our office about working on the gas intestine, or the gaseous intestine. But nevertheless, that image of the intestine that we all know is tightly packed into the gut communicates all of this idea in the most convenient, simple image. Everyone here probably has a sense that I already get this, even though that there's a whole lot of those gory physics details and background. This is sort of just a reminder, an anecdote about my mother always said there's a lot of people don't like their jobs, and if you offer them the chance to join you in something heroic, something fun, something interesting, they will offer you an enormous amount of help. And I think this is underappreciated as regards narrative. You want people to help you, so they will help you the more exciting your mission and your vision sounds to them, and the better you illustrate that, the more free work you'll get out of other people. So here's actual prototype that we built before visualizing this. So we're working on soft robotics and soft prosthetics for interesting applications like healing people's legs. So this thing actually is like a muscle, soft muscle that you strap onto your leg. Again, those prototypes are so crude that it's difficult to sort of show people what to do. But if you're lucky enough to work with people like Nick Dragotta, and you all could be, and you should pay artists, they're a critical part of what we do. You can easily make everyone understand, oh, this is why this is a useful thing. I could have superhuman strength. I could help paraplegics walk. There's a lot of interesting applications for this stuff. Here are some more ruminations on the new types of machines that you could build with that technology. Perhaps just to finish, again, this is another dystopian future of fossil fuels, and more just because accidentally I wrote a fart joke about 6 years ago for this conference. This is the introduction. So this is the dystopian future we're headed to. But I want to remind you all, we need to save this world. And if it isn't us adults, it's going to be children like this sinking into the bathtub. And you can see as he sinks into the bathtub, he does indeed break wind. And then, here we go. Energy prices going through the roof. I like this. The DOE can't wait to catch a whiff of this research. Again, I think this really, and I can't, although it's cheesy to end with this joke, but I think we all are too earnest about our technologies as technologies. We take ourselves too seriously, and I think it drives people away. You need to also have a sense of whimsy, a sense of fun. It's just as important as painting that beautiful future as to say, and we can have some fun along the way, and that will get everyone fighting on your side with you. Thanks.
So I think out of most of the panels or discussions at the summit this week, this topic is very, like I was telling you before, kind of a soft topic, like a little bit fluffy.
I showed equations.
We talk about this stuff in Silicon Valley a lot, but for researchers or scientists, this maybe seems a little bit more distant. But I think we would all agree that it's extremely important. And so I wanted to get your takes. You talked about it a little bit so far, but what are the actual kind of hard benefits that these researchers and entrepreneurs can deliver to their companies by creating these narratives and stories? What are the most important things?
Sure. If I were to name the single biggest benefit I've seen to narrative in many of the organizations I work with, national labs, which are based on relatively academic cultures of rigor and peer review and so on, it's that every initiative happening at a national lab or any other academic or laboratory style environment, every initiative needs a mechanism to propel it forward. And any methods to propel an initiative forward can and should be considered by the researchers. And I think that creating narratives and creating story-style visualizations of the future, not very late in the program, but from the very outset of a particular engagement, crafting that message and then continuing to evolve it in sort of narratives of increasing fidelity as you go along. You know, I personally have seen that do wonderful things to help researchers drive forward and propel forward what it is they're working on.
So in the original product development and concept development?
I would say we might be talking here about product or concept development. We might be talking about something much more early and abstract, like numerical analysis using chaos theory as applied to weather patterns or something like that. Even on something that early and upstream, Katie, a narrative can and should be applied to demonstrate the end benefits and the possibilities of what it is you're working on.
I think there's 7 answers to your question. All of them are super important. Quite frankly, if you're doing anything sufficiently ambitious, it's going to cost you a lot of money. And you need to have a great narrative to convince people to stick with you. And if it's sufficiently ambitious, it's not going to work first time, and it's not going to work quickly. So it has to be a sufficiently strong and engaging narrative that it can survive some cuts and bruises. And I think if any audience in the technology world can understand it, it's an energy audience. You really need that strong narrative for that reason. On the very, well, not mundane, but very important practical level, you know, I work in the Bay Area where if you can spell Java and you're 22, you can get $120,000 a year salary. And, you know, if you're an energy startup, you can't quite pay those salaries. So you need an unbelievably strong narrative to get the best and brightest of the generation to work with you on these things. So it's hugely important narrative in hiring, in motivating teams, keeping them together, keeping the best talent. So, you know, and then in dealing with the press will write you all the press you ever need if you write them maybe I shouldn't say this in front of a journalist who I know, but you are time short, and the more I can help you have that engaging story up front, the easier it is for you to give me the free media that will propel the project along.
You can be my puppet master.
Yeah, I can't think of any single reason that narrative is bad. It only helps every aspect of your project.
How do you know when you're telling the right narrative? Or is there when you saying you can't think of a reason, but is there, you know, you're talking about mistakes earlier, is there like a wrong narrative? Or how do you know when you have stumbled onto the right one?
If I knew the answer to that question, I probably would not be working in technology.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure. I think you know when you're telling the very wrong story. People at dinner, if your narrative doesn't survive the dinner party test, you know you're in trouble, right? You have to at least be able to entertain your friends and family. If your mother turns off when you tell her your narrative for what you're doing, I think you're really in big trouble.
Saul, I think you're exactly right. I think the answer to how do you know when you're telling the right narrative, I would turn that around a little bit. I would say you will almost certainly get your narrative wrong if you're starting to apply narrative at the right spot, which is very early on in the process. You know, we worked for an a clean energy management company called Tendril, developing a monitor for them, for people to use in their homes to both to interact with their energy usage and ultimately to foster behavior change based on that increased understanding. We built a set of narratives based on sketches of what the device, the in-home device, might look like. And we knew that we were getting things wrong. We started with some basic insights on home energy behavior and continued to craft the narrative based on people's extraordinarily willingness to tell us why it was stupid and what was wrong with it. And I think early stage narratives, early stage low fidelity narratives, by their nature, welcome that kind of feedback.
Got it. Okay. Can you take us through like those types of tangible steps that some of the entrepreneurs and researchers out there need to take to tell these stories? Like, is it something? Do you have, you know, this is my kind of checklist of things that I need to go through before I can deliver something compelling?
Mm-hmm. I think I have an easy answer, and I don't know if he's in the audience, but I have an example. I was sitting outside just moments before we came in, and someone I didn't know comes up and sits next to Katie and I and says, "What do you work on?" And we sort of avoided the question. And then he just smiled hugely and said, well, I have this amazing thing that I'm doing that's awesome. It's battery testing equipment that is super important so we can predict the life of batteries so that we'll be able to finance them better. And the absolute joy and passion of this young man working on this technology was fantastic. Let's be honest, battery testing equipment is a difficult thing to sell to the front page of the New York Times, yet his passion was enough to carry that story. And I think what you don't, maybe I'm avoiding your question or shifting it to where I want to go, but I think every single person in this room is working on what they're working on because you're passionate about what you do. What astounds me is that we can take our passions as technologists and hide it so extraordinarily behind a veil of boredom. Yet we are all doing it because, oh my God, the thing I'm working on is awesome. And anyway, he was perfect. He was like, I never saw such a great beaming smile. So, in some respects, the first customer for your own narrative is yourself. And in fact, that just means use the one that's the reason you're doing what you're doing. People want to know. People want to engage with, you are all trying to save the world or something like that. And, tell us your story.
So Saul, let's unpack that a little bit. I agree. The guy we met just outside a few minutes ago was passionate, and because we all have the ability to sense when people are interested in what they're talking about, that makes them interesting. Conversely, if he had been bored with what he was talking about and just sort of, giving us a perfunctory description of battery testing, we would have known that as well, and we both would have tuned out. So I believe that what he had gone through describes the sort of process we always encourage people to go through when they're considering creating narrative, which is, first of all, expressed in the negative. You can't just come up with a story or a narrative cold, right? We're all smart people in this room. You couldn't just sit 6 people down and come up with stories about more intelligent home energy usage or better use of a heliostat or something like that without some background. And so we think that it's very important to go through a process of understanding, and that can come from everything from book learning to qualitative conversations with stakeholders that are important to you, to the point where you have a certain level of synthesis, a certain level of, with a small group of people often, shared understanding, shared insights, and shared appreciation of the problem you're trying to solve. And once you have that sort of sense of shared insight, we find it's then that sort of shared insight can catalyze a lot of interesting narratives and a lot of interesting stories that you can tell.
And I think jumping off from what Saul was saying, everyone in this room is passionate about what they're doing, or probably most people, but I think the problem is getting it from your own passion to equating it to making other people understand it and feel your passion. And it seems like one of the only ways to do that is to constantly interact with people and throw ideas against them and kind of see get that idea out there to other people.
Rather like technology, the best narrative is found by failing a lot. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. In that respect, kind of how much of plotting out these stories do you think is emotion-driven versus data-driven? Right brain versus left brain. Is it a combination? Is it largely passion?
I think without exception, a good story is emotionally led, emotionally driven, and data informed. And I think that's how we should think of it. That doesn't mean that data and hard facts become any less important in any of our endeavors. It means that we're expanding the sort of dynamic range and the scope of our own personal behavior to include both the equations that Saul showed a little earlier, the deep consideration of rigorous and analytical realities, combined with the more subjective, right-brained and emotional side that leads to narrative.
Yeah, I desperately hope that there is no narrative engaging enough or strong enough to sell the world perpetual motion machines. But sadly, I think we see a lot of those narratives all the time.
Sure.
So I try as hard as I can. That's why I put some equations here to show you this is how this equation translates into this vision of the future. I think we need more of that. There is a lot of charlataneering in the energy space. So, yeah, I'm not sure what the point is there. Maybe it's just my bugbear, but yes, there are still people selling untruths.
We do need lots of data.
We do need a lot of data. We do need a lot more analysis, and we need to be willing to, call people out when, hey, that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
How important is prototyping in your guys' process? I talked a little bit about the smart car and Tesla, using that as an example, and I know in hardware, obviously, Saul, you have to use that a lot, but like how crucial is prototyping for your process?
I can't say enough about the value of prototyping for any innovation endeavor. And I always recommend to people that they expand the definition of prototyping, particularly if you have a technical background. If your background is in science or engineering, most of us think of prototypes as engineering tools for risk mitigation. Most of us are trained to identify the risk areas in a particular complex program or endeavor, pluck those out, and mitigate those risks with analysis and prototypes and iterative testing. Those are fine prototypes, but I think if you want to innovate, it really helps to expand your definition of prototype to include anything that helps you to visualize what the future is going to look like, behave like, or feel like. So by those standards, the sketched images, the cartoon sketches that Saul showed of a future energy installation are a prototype because they're a visualization of the future intended to elicit responses from certain key stakeholders. And similarly, when we were working with Ford on new gauges for their hybrid cars, we created actually the numbers are we created 120 concepts and 18 quite mature prototypes of different elements of a dashboard cluster, which ultimately led to 18 distinct interactive elements on the dashboard of the Ford Fusion. I don't see how we could have arrived at that just taking what I call the traditional funnel model, where you consider a great many different ideas and then sort of inexorably narrow them down to a small number of ideas. You need to go iteratively through cycle after cycle after cycle of many different prototypes when you try to do something disruptive.
Okay.
I'd love to say prototypes aren't important because they're desperately expensive, but
especially in your industry.
Yeah. But we are not good enough at modeling the physical world yet to do that. But I think we are getting a lot better at modeling the physical world. I always try to be very much understand the math and the physics, the materials first, and then use the prototypes to inform intuition. But goddamn, it is expensive.
Yeah.
How much do you think you guys spend on it out of your total budget?
I'm not disclosing that here.
Just thought I would ask. Tell us a little bit about some of the pitfalls that you've encountered putting together narratives. So you talked about things that had inspired you, but kind of what are some big lessons you've learned as you've gone through these processes of, what have you, like different tips and tricks that you guys have learned through the years of how to create good narratives?
The best lesson I ever learned was from an African-American poetess that I can't remember even where I met her. And it was in a bar somewhere, that happens, I guess. And we were talking, she wanted to know what I was working on at the time. I was doing a lot of stuff around climate change and energy and the interactions between the two. And I was completely depressed because you could not tell this story sufficiently well to anyone except the already sold on it to engage them in the story of energy and climate change. And she said, your problem is that you're not making it a love story. And it's basically true. I think the best lesson I ever learned from her was you really need to make your stories and your narratives a love story for the future you can create, a love story for the people these technologies will help. And, if you only take 1-2 words away from this panel, I would say the two most important words to understand, your stories need to be love stories. And if you are good at those love stories, people will help you incredibly on your way there.
What about you?
I think the biggest mistake that we made for many years was in thinking that narrative was some sort of innate talent as opposed to a learnable skill. Now, while different people have different levels of aptitudes towards storytelling and narrative, if any of you have this notion that storytelling and narrative is some sort of innate talent that people either have or they don't, that's sort of an old, archaic image of creativity that I urge all of you to reject. There is abundant anecdotal and also academic evidence that the type of creativity that leads to storytelling is a discrete set of learnable skills. And I think that was an important discovery for us. Another area where we've fallen down is we've learned that you can't take attributes of some new product or some new service that you're thinking about and just sort of translate those or map those into a narrative. The best narratives start from a heartfelt, empathetic appreciation for the needs of whoever your stakeholders are in the field and whoever is going to make your endeavor for a success. And the best narratives are built on that heartfelt and empathetic understanding.
Okay. And I wanted to open it up for questions, either over the internet or in the audience. I guess text ASK9 and your questions to 22333. You can also tweet them at poll ASK9. Send us your questions. One thing, Dave, you might be a little biased on this, but when do you know if you should work with an outside firm? When do you know if you're not telling your story well enough and you need to work with other people? What stage should you go through that, and when do you know to make that type of decision?
I mean, partnering, narrative aside, the decision about the decision about when to partner is absolutely huge, and it's something that justifies a lot of thought. Let me put it to you this way. If you're going to create something new, if you're going to innovate, and storytelling and narrative is an important element of innovation, there are really only three ways to innovate. You can insource, you can outsource, and you can acquire, right? Insourcing means that you're growing organic capabilities within your organization to innovate. And innovation is defined as creation that results from study and experimentation. Outsourcing means you go to a company like McKinsey or IDEO or someone like that to help you to create new ideas. And acquire means that you license or purchase an organization to help expand your innovation portfolio. Any combination of any one of those three approaches, insourcing, outsourcing, and acquisition, can potentially make for a viable innovation strategy. Okay? GE, for many, many years, had extraordinarily successful innovation programs primarily through acquisition. Okay? Now they're shifting, interestingly, to an increased focus on organic intuition for good reasons. The key point about this is that the strategy must be mindful. The strategy must be created at the very top of the organization and must be set out deliberately. What we mustn't ever do is just allow the innovation strategy of the mix of those three approaches to just sort of happen spontaneously or through happenstance or through, by chance coming upon interesting partners or something like that. This needs to be mindful and deliberate.
Just to be cheeky, I have a much less costly solution. I think you should all go and volunteer at your local middle school to talk to the 10-year-olds there and ask them the question, if you could invent anything for the future, what would you invent? And those kids will give you the most, at 10 years old, you haven't hit puberty yet, the whole world is perfect, right? They will give you the most astounding visions of the future and things that need to be invented that don't exist and why the world would be cool if this thing existed, etc., etc., etc. And I kind of think it's why the history of comic books, which is projected at that age group, is why it's such a great medium and why I enjoy it. But then 10-year-olds themselves are just a great medium because they're not yet tired and cynical and feel that things are impossible. And I guarantee if you do that once for 1 hour with 20 of those kids, they'll tell you amazing stories. And if we have too much time, I'll tell you lots of fun, inspiring stories of 10-year-olds.
And just to the ARPA-E folks, if you guys are monitoring the questions, I can't see them on the iPad. So if anyone wants to come up and hand me some, that'd be great. Or help me out. Okay, I wanted to specifically change our conversation around energy technologies, since it's been a little bit broader. I mean, when you look at, you guys have pioneered design thinking. I mean, are there ways that you think design thinking can be really focused on, I think it logged out, but how design thinking should be practiced in the energy sector? Or do you think that's lacking?
I think in general, innovation and specific methods and tools of innovation should certainly be applied and should be considered by everyone operating in the energy sector. The big four in innovation are design thinking, which is, as it happens, what we do at IDEO, open innovation, disruptive innovation, and competitively driven innovation. So let's talk for a second about what design thinking is, and then let's talk about how we've seen it well applied. The notion of design thinking is very simple. Design thinking says this. It says, let's look at all kinds of creative professions. Let's look at graphic arts. Let's look at design engineering. Let's look at architecture. Let's look at organizations that have, year after year delivered fresh thinking. What are some of the attributes of those organizations? How can we distill some of those attributes and apply them in new disciplines, apply them in government, apply them in the energy industry, and so on? Some of the attributes of all design thinking organizations are, without exception, they take inspiration from human beings. Okay? Innovation and creativity and creation requires inspiration, and the single strongest source of inspiration, at least design thinkers believe this, is other human beings. Okay? Second, all good design thinkers make use of methods like brainstorming to create a broad set of ideas. Good design thinkers use their inspiration gained from human beings to visualize solutions. And then finally, design thinkers always make appropriate use of prototypes, whether those are storyboard prototypes to prototype some new service or physical prototypes of some massive new installation. Where we have found particular application in design thinking, and maybe this is just chance, maybe this is just the projects we've worked on at IDEO, is it's my personal impression that the energy industry and the energy sector spends an enormous amount of time thinking about the supply side, as well it should. Those issues are enormous, and in many cases doesn't have quite the understanding it should of the design side, of the businesses and the consumers that are actually the end users of energy. And we're entering an era where end consumers of energy have unprecedented levels of choice and information and control. And so I think it's important for energy providers to gain a deeper understanding of the demand side of their market, as well as the traditionally deep understanding of the supply side, the smart grid, and so on. And I think design thinking, as it's laid out, is a particularly good tool to help foster that understanding.
Are there products out there in the energy space that you've seen that have kind of told a very successful narrative? I brought up Nest, the smart thermostat, and Tesla's Model S, but are there ones that you guys have seen that have done well, do you think?
Good narrative products? Tesla has done a great job, I think. I hope that they can pivot from where they are to making lots of cars for everyone. But I think it was a very wise decision to go for that luxury segment at that stage of the industry. I think in terms of promoting open innovation, we all heard of the GE Eco-Imagination program, so I think they certainly got the mind share. I actually think the very large companies and the fossil fuel companies do this extraordinarily well. I mean, the whole Chevron human energy thing, regardless of whether you think that they're doing a lot with that, has been very good. So the people who do the narratives really are the narratives that I remember are unfortunately the ones that are on the billboards. I don't have enough great examples. I think we've mentioned them. Tesla, Nest, and after that the list is not hugely long.
Yeah.
There's more scandals than there are fabulous examples.
I was sure impressed by a narrative kit that the Department of Energy put together. It was called Fast Forward, and the DOE concluded that their reach was extraordinary, but that their influence with all kinds of private sector energy firms could be enhanced if they created, this is really interesting to me, a kit to create shared narrative in meetings. So the meetings that they set, they created a kit that included many different modes of potential communication to kind of catalyze narrative with partners. So for instance, there was a set of flashcards with little narrative elements. There was a 1-minute video that was relatively open-ended. There was a general purpose PowerPoint deck that could be customized, this sort of thing. And they used those to set up meetings with external partners whose specific objective was to create shared narrative in order to explore possible, support and cooperation.
Okay. Since I broke the device that is asking questions from
Can't take her anywhere.
The audience, is there anyone who wants to we only have a couple minutes left, but is there anyone who has a burning question that wants to throw anything out there? Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, bring them on.
Well, okay, so as these stories would play out with the kids, what would happen, Nick Dragota would be illustrating. I would say to the kids, if you could invent anything, what would you invent? And then while I was working with them on how they might realize what they invented, Nick would draw it. Turns out with 10-year-old boys, if you ask a room full, 97%, not great data, not terribly accurate, but roughly 97% will say, I want a flying skateboard or a skateboard that flies or some permutation of flying and skateboard, which is very easy to draw and very easy to explain because, we all know, lift equals, half rho AV, CD, cubed, whatever. So you could run that through all the boys. Girls always want to build the machine that can read the dreams of their friends.
I want that now.
Which is fantastic. And you think about it, that means that, essentially all these 10-year-old girls are 50 years into the future already. Because and I think this is neuroscience that we're now starting to do. So then you tell them the story, this is the cusp, you guys are right on the cusp of stuff, this is how you become a neuroscientist, so you can dissect cat brains, blah, blah, blah. Remember, so we're going through this exercise. Anyway, I remember this one girl, I think we were actually in West Virginia on a book tour, and she's just stands up and completely didactically says, I want to build a robotic cow. And Nick and I are sort of mystified. She says, well, as you know, cows have 4 stomachs. The first stomach will be the wash cycle. The second stomach will be the rinse cycle. The third stomach will be the dry cycle. And the fourth stomach will press and fold my clothes, and then it will eat my clothes and poop out pressed, clean, fold clothes in my wardrobe.
That's great.
And the narrative was executed more cleanly and perfectly than I just gave you. And it's like, you know what? I know exactly what you want, and I want it too, right? And this is what I mean. You're for free. These kids will give you these fantastic examples of well-executed narratives. I was completely sold on that. I still am working on the robotic cow. It's coming along. I have an robotic elephant, but not a cow yet. So we're getting there.
I can stay privately to answer those if they want.
Sure, go ahead.
So first, I was at elementary school recently, and we were doing a solar panel project there. So I asked some of the classes, would be ways how you can reduce the amount of energy in your building. And the number one answer the boys gave was, we should stop flushing our toilets. So it's not very hygienic. One thing about narratives, when you tell with narratives, you fall in love with your project yourself. Mm-hmm. And it can be really hard to quit if the project doesn't work out. Mm-hmm. Can you share some experiences?
Yeah.
Projects you love, but you had to quit because it didn't work out?
Yeah. I'm sure that both of us have had many such experiences. The question for those that...
I've never been able to suffocate a single baby.
Thank you for sharing.
Awkward.
The question for those of you that didn't hear it were, narrative can be so powerful that are there ways that you can mitigate the natural emotional attachment that happens? This is I think another strength of getting comfortable with pushing prototyping absolutely as early in the process as possible. Almost without exception, if somebody spends, months or years of his or her life on a given solution, prototyping and developing a certain solution, he or she will develop a deep emotional attachment to that solution. And all of a sudden, now, you've lost your meritocracy of ideas because you reject ideas because they're not yours, because your idea is so mature and you've committed so much time and energy to it. That's not how we're going to solve energy problems. And the best advice I can give, something that's painful for us, but that we force ourselves to do, is create an abundance of low-fidelity prototypes to help you reduce emotional attachment, and then kill them off early before they develop sort of a life of their own, in order to allow ideas to advance based on a consensus view of their merit and their benefits, as opposed to who introduced them or how long someone has been working on them.
I think your question is 100% spot on accurate, and we all suffer from perhaps not doing this as well as possible.
Yeah.
I guess my only answer to you is to try and be the best scientist or the best engineer that you can be, and always look at the math, look at the data, and have it drive. That's easy to say because most things we do are very engineering-y and less interfacing with humans, where I think this question becomes even more difficult. But yes, you should, I don't know, maybe a New Year's resolution should be what should I change next year? Yeah.
This is a similar question from the internet. Let's see, where is it? I just have it. Oh, do you worry about pushing or hyping the story too far and potentially losing credibility? One is too much.
I think I don't really, as long as you are confident in your analysis and your physics and you work with really good people and you beat each other up before you go public with the actual underlying science and engineering, I feel pretty comfortable to tell the story. And you have to be prepared to take a pie in the face if you are wrong. But I actually think in the energy domain we need to get to what is going to be right faster, and that will mean getting to a few things wrong a little bit faster, which means we sort of need to throw more resources at all possible solutions, which means that we need to tell our story better, because really we all suffer for lack of resources. We all have ambitions larger. We want to go faster with our projects. We want to go bigger, et cetera, et cetera. Everyone in this room is here. Well, I mean, we're here because it's ARPA-E and they have some resources, right? We all need more resources to go faster. So I think the downside of getting it wrong or going too early is not nearly as down as the high side, right? You can get more resources, and especially now in the highly connected world, the more you talk about what you do, the more excited you are about what you do, the easier it is to find. People will call you offering help. At least that's my experience. And I don't think it benefits anyone to. You only become that crazy old inventor if you hide it in the cupboard and it's not ready to show yet.
I'll tell you where I've seen narrative gone wrong and appear to be overhyped, and where I've been sorry in retrospect, is I always ask myself, are the production values of this narrative way too mature in view of the maturity of the product or service? Okay. So, for example, working on a smart inverter about a year ago, which was designed around improving power factor correction. The idea was still really embryonic, and we had a relatively high fidelity video showing with a lot of detail the benefits of the idea. And in retrospect, I'm sorry we did that, not because the notion of narrative was wrong, but because the program was so early on, it really sort of warranted a lower fidelity form of narrative, like simple sketch storyboards or something like that.
Okay. All right, so apologies if we didn't get your question answered, but I'm sure these guys will stick around for a little bit and you can come talk to them. But thank you very much to Dave and Saul, and we're excited about telling the future stories of energy and making the future awesome, as Saul says.
Great. Thank you.